Hi, I'm Bob Putnam from the May Institute and the National Technical Assistance Center, and we're really happy to see you this morning. Just to know who's in the audience, how many teachers do we have here? Okay, cool. How many behavioral responders do we have here? All right, we got a bunch of those people, right? How many administrators or those who think they're administrators, right? All right, that's cool. All right. So we're going to do in terms of, let me go to the next slide, right? We're going to give you some big ideas around de-escalation, and then we have a couple case examples in terms that will show you what they've done to improve their de-escalation strategies. So our goal is hopefully we hit all of your interests in terms of that across the board. Our slides are already up, so you can take a look at that, and if you have questions, you can get back to us. So one of the questions we ask is how much time do you spend preventing problem behavior versus responding to problem behavior, right? And what we were going to do, I usually do poll everywhere, but there's too many people in terms of this. So I'm going to put up the slide the last time that we did this, right? Do you provide faculty-wide training on de-escalation of challenging behavior? And 22% said yes at the beginning of the year, less than 61 minutes, right? Yes at the beginning and throughout the year, less than 61 minutes, right? Yes at the beginning, more than 61 minutes. Yes at the beginning and throughout the year, more than 61 minutes, but not a lot, right, in terms of that. And some said not at all, right? We don't provide any de-escalation training. So then we asked the behavioral responders, right? All those people that were behavioral responders, right, who put their hands up. How much of your day do you spend responding to behavior? Right? 5% of my day, 10% of my day, less than 25%, less than 40%, 50% said more than 40% of your day. So one of the things we want to do is basically look at how do we begin to even that out, right? That our goal is if you invest in good de-escalation strategies, you can save that time on the other end. And the goal would be you can spend more of your time in terms of what you want to do than responding to behavior, responding to behaviors, right? And then we said, how well do you implement PBS, right? We don't implement PBS at all, right? 38%, right? That's not the question here, right? You guys are great implementers. We implement PBS, but don't measure fidelity with a standard fidelity measure, right? About 41%. At the bottom, we implement Tier 1 and Tier 2 using a standardized fidelity measure, right? By 5%, right? And this was a PBS conference, and that we were presenting this to. So one of the things we're going to show you is fidelity makes a difference. There is an F word in PBS, right? And it does make a difference in terms of as you push through fidelity. The higher your fidelity, the less time you're going to spend in terms of de-escalation. All right, so we have a brief that just got published on improving Tier 3 implementation outcomes in a high-needs school that shows you in terms of what we did in terms of that and shows the amount of time saved in terms of responding to behavior. So I'm going to say, this is free. It's up on the PBIS website. And there's a couple other things if you want to look at this particular thing. If you look at 3H from yesterday, scaling up tier, it goes into what we did in terms of improving Tier 3 interventions. All right? And there's also another brief that would be basically in terms of strategies for de-escalating student behavior. So I would suggest you take a look at those. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Brian.
All right, start my timer.
Yep.
10 minutes, here we go. Can you guys hear me in the back? Can't tell, no? Can we turn this up a little bit? I don't know. Oh, is it on? Can you guys hear me in the back? Excellent. That was good technical assistance. In 9 minutes, I'm gonna break down some key ideas from this brief. I'm starting my timer. This isn't a training, this is an orientation. You need to have some basic foundational PBIS understanding for this to make a lot of sense. This brief, though, we wrote, co-designing it with the content I'm giving you. So I'm just gonna try to give it to you fast, okay? You came in, I had you read that news article about Sydney, that student that was restrained. And some things I like to do is I like people to think about, I wasn't there. I wasn't in the shoes of the folks and the adults or the police officers And for the people from that district, you could be here today. I don't know the story, I just read it. But I think we can look at it and do a good analysis on what were the challenges that took place that led to a student getting restrained by police, a 9-year-old restrained by police officers in her classroom because she was stabbing at a whiteboard, for example. So we need to think about that and how can we do a better job of preventing and changing the environment of the schools so that we are encouraging the right behaviors and giving teachers the tools they need to address dangerous behaviors. Some like to talk about the crisis cycle in school. I love this. Think of a classroom, student displays a behavior, teacher responds to the behavior. Okay? Student says, let's go. I will respond to you now. The teacher says, I got someone on a walkie-talkie. They're gonna come in because this is something I don't know how to do. So they're gonna go ahead and respond to the student. The walkie-talkie holder comes in and she's like, I'm here, boom, cape on, let's do it. And she responds to the student. Student's function is met. Teacher's need is met. The clinician wearing the cape, her need is met. I had a pager, I didn't have a walkie-talkie, that was my gig. And yeah, there's something about being the adult who's like, let me help. Right? I mean, I got into the work for that reason. I love that. I could help de-escalate a student. And this will keep repeating. This is just, we are reinforcing what's going to keep happening here. We've got to break that cycle. That is not the method that's going to change the environment for success. Okay? So problems with current approaches in de-escalation, some examples. We know there's excessive misuse of restraint and seclusion. Policy might encourage that. Inconsistent adult behavior is a playground for students. If my first period teacher, my third period teacher treat my behaviors differently, game on. Okay, we need adults to be consistent. We only focus on the responses traditionally. We rely on that referral logic. I have someone I can call if things are out of control, so we over-rely on that. Or what we're going to tell staff to do is going to be complicated, too complicated, or it's a separate siloed effort. We're going to do PBIS, and separately, this is how we're going to handle when students are out of control. Okay? So, I need you to think about what you've learned from this forum in terms of PBIS, and I want you to think about, my worldview is through these 5 essential elements. I can look at any situation and say, what are we doing to help the adults there? What's the data say about the de-escalation, how often, how frequent, how intense? What's the equity story there? Are certain populations over or underrepresented? What are the tools my teachers are using to help students stay regulated? What are we trying to get to? So there's advantages to doing this work through the framework. It can align the efforts of your school rather than treating de-escalation or crisis management or whatever you want to call it as a separate conversation. It's got to be a part of what we're doing. And just so you guys know, this is prevention work. This is tier 1 work. Tier 1 is where we're going to really create the climate and the culture of the school you want. And if you're going to try to improve behavior top down, handling students out of control and think you have a magic intervention that's going to somehow prevent, after inappropriate behavior occurs, then you will never get the climate you want. Because your climate is resulting in the frequency. Your current school is perfectly designed to get the outcomes you're currently getting. And the positives, what's going well, awesome. Those will continue. I can give you a whole bunch of new students, you'll still get those positives, and you're still going to get the frequency of whatever challenges you have right now. So the work is always about the environment. This is about tier 1. All right, so I'm going to give you a crash course in how to think about this through the lens of PBIS. The first thing, for me, for you, what are you currently doing? Think of classroom practices. What are the practices you have right now in your buildings that can fit already into these 4 simplified phases? Okay? What do teachers do to encourage the right behavior in the classroom? Do you have specific classroom practices that you're teaching your teachers? So having clear expectations, using praise specific praise for behavior, using group contingencies, lesson plans to teach social skills. Find out what those are, write them up there. Phase 1. What about when students need some more behavioral support? Inappropriate language, refusing to come into the classroom, starting to tap aggressively on their desk, saying, "F you, old man." What do you tell your teachers to do for that? I'm assuming you already have some practices. Get organized, as that's what the story is here. Take those and put those into escalation. As behavior increases, we need to simplify for the adults the tools they're using. I can give you a toolkit. I want to give you a routine. Let's keep it simple. That helps me as an adult stay regulated. Okay? So when it comes to crisis, do you have a crisis routine? When a student is throwing the chair and it's continuing, what's the simplest routine we can create for our adults so that they can say, are you following this routine? Okay? And then for recovery, what strategies do you have to reintegrate students? What do you expect of your adults? That's the big idea of de-escalation is what are you currently doing, get it organized. And by what are you currently doing, here's an example. Here's like 6 classroom practices that we refer to a lot. These are not the only ones. There's other practices, but these are 6 good ones, research validated. And 1, 2, 3, 4 are all about that prevention work. And 5 is a continuum of responses. So you could just look at this, for example, and break, here's phase 1. Here's phase 2. Okay? Start with what you have. All right, here we go. This is the visual that we're going to ask our exemplars to kind of share a little bit about where they are along this process. What we did is, we took those categories, prevention, escalation, crisis, restoration, and we put the practices for tier 1 for prevention, the ones that were shown in the previous slide, right there. We're not treating prevention like it's something different because we're talking de-escalation. This is school. This is what you're going to do. You're going to use active supervision, encouraging appropriate behaviors, academic engagement, rigor, opportunities to respond. When students are becoming dysregulated, so we have the youth behavior at the top, we have what's happening in the brain. They might be starting to become dysregulated. Well, what do you normally do? Physical proximity, using praising appropriate behavior in others. Error correction, telling the student what they're doing inappropriately and giving them the expectation. Reteaching. Maybe you have other strategies depending on the intensity of your youth. Down here we have routines, which are skills that we can teach our students. Do you have a regulation routine that all of your students practice at neutral times? Okay? Anybody been really upset and someone says, 2 more minutes? That's all I need. Anybody? It's not true. Anybody been really upset and someone says, take a deep breath, and you're like, oh, you really? Now? Yeah, don't practice that when you're dysregulated. You practice how to breathe properly when you're regulated so then you can draw upon it. Those are examples. All right, that's the big idea. Here's a teaching matrix. Look where that shows up. In my classroom, when you feel upset, this is the routine I want you to use. And you know what? I'm going to pull that right from my social emotional curriculum that we have. We already have curriculum on how to calm down. Let's not create parallel worlds here. Boom. And I'm going to teach this to my students actively. I don't know, whatever I need. 3 times a week, we're all going to practice this as part of our brain breaks. I can draw upon that skill. That's a skill you're building, okay? So we're in that prevention world. Let's jump fast forward to that crisis phase. A couple routines you're going to need on that previous slide is, first, adults need to know how are students going to test you. And you're going to need a routine that prevents you from getting into arguments with students, because that's where that cycle kicks off, when you take that bait. So here's an example. I only have 1 minute left. I'm not going to break it down, but it's a good reference for thinking about ways students might try to accelerate the behaviors. And this was my world. We were great at this column. No matter what the students said in response, we ignored the content and we spoke to the expectation. And if you can build that routine and practice that in your adults, you prevent arguments. I'll tell you, that's going to be huge. You have a better phrase for it, maybe, when you talk about what your staff said. Okay? The big ideas, I'm going to move on from that one. The question is, how do you know if what you're currently doing is working? And there is a way. In PBIS, we ask all schools, what's your triangle of your current interventions? Yes? That's this first column. You should then ask for those interventions, have we checked the fidelity? Are we doing them the right way? That's the second column. And then the third column here is, and then what does that mean? So teachers are teaching the skill of the week 3 mornings each week. That's my expectation. On 11.4, we asked teachers and 72% said they taught it that week. And on 11.21, we looked at our referral data and we've had an 18% reduction in those specific behaviors. That's awesome. Like, that's a really good model of the Tier 1 team doing its job to install behaviors. Okay? When it comes to crisis, I just want to jump to this crisis routine as an example. I said keep it simple, right? So here is a 3-step routine. A statement to regulate with named a prompt, a simple word of empathy, and a simple instruction. And so when I have a student and it's been 4 hours and he's still taking his share and he's still slamming it, and I'm like, I know you're really frustrated right now, but the good choice is have a seat. Show me you can have a seat. And I'm going to go step 1, step 2, step 1, step 2, but I have to do it with care. They have to believe me, and I got to stay in this space, and I have to ignore the other content. And that's an example of, it's not the only one, that's an example of a super simple routine, and your adults will thank you for it because it gives them the tool. What does this mean? All right. There's more ways to break this down. Bob won't let me do it. But I would like to have our first exemplar come up. My friend Megan, and she's going to tell you her story. And I'm going to give you this.
I don't know what my time is, so I'm just going to keep looking.
You have 15 minutes.
15 minutes.
They want to hear from you.
All right. So I'm Megan Dwyer. I am the principal at Gages Lake School, which is in the Special Ed District of Lake County. We are about an hour north from here. I'm really jealous for those of you who got to fly out of your state to come here. I had to Uber, so it's not as exciting. But we are the largest co-op in the state of Illinois. We have 31 member districts, and in my building, we have 2 programs that we service. We have your traditional ED-ALT program, kindergarten through 6th grade, and then we also have what's called Shaping Appropriate Behavior, and that is students with intellectual disabilities and students with emotional disabilities. So very different, but super fun. And it's been really a mission of ours to make sure that what we do for one, we do for the other. And so the staff, doesn't matter which program or type of student that they're engaging with, the process is the same, right? And we've learned through that on how much we actually take from the SAB side actually really helps our ED side. So we have more visuals, we have less talking, we have more, you're gonna see in our building, our matrix is completely all visuals for our students on be safe, we just changed it to be kind and be responsible. And so we wanted to make sure it was an inclusive environment, but we're also learning that our kindergartner through 6th graders aren't readers either anymore, right? From 6th grade, and we've got students who are reading at a kindergarten, 1st grade level. And so we needed to make sure we met those needs as well. And so our matrices don't look the same as what we just were shown. We really have no words in ours. We average 60 to 70 students, and we are in our year 5 of implementation of all 3 tiers. And this really came from not by choice. I was brought into the school 5 years ago because of a really bad restraint that hit the national news. And that really put a lot of pressure on us from not just the state and the district, but also 31 member districts and a whole lot of angry parents, right? We are still working through that. If you Google us, it's still the first thing that comes up, even though we have a lot of positive things going on. And we spend a lot of time trying to build that trust with our parents to place, because I promise you what you read in the news, you wouldn't put your baby there. So what we've learned through the last 5 years, we have found that de-escalation has to be intentional. It has to be intentional. And just as much as we teach our students over and over again, right, their coping skills, how to handle a difficult situation, how to handle the word no, right? That had to be really retaught after COVID because I'm just as guilty as a mom throwing anything at my kid so I could be a principal online, right? So he wasn't used to hearing the word no all day anymore. So we work really through that. We had to be intentional, so we have to revisit this. I really like the first slide that Bob showed about teaching at the beginning of the year de-escalation because it cannot be a one and done. This has to be revisited, and it's really important in my role of looking at how my staff are responding to crises and situations and use that data to drive when to reteach it again. And sometimes in August and September, I don't have to teach it as often. January, I really have to reteach it, right? The last week of school, we're going to talk about it every day. And there might be some emails in the middle of the day to remind you of our processes. So really being intentional on that. And historically, what we have documented as de-escalation and teaching that has been, we call it NCI, a lot of people call it CPI, but we really relied that on our training. But when you think of the CPI training, and all of you have been CPI trained, I'm sure, huge chunk, right? You don't think of the de-escalation, you're talking about going hands-on. And so when we refer to this with my staff, and I talked about, what is CPI, let's talk about the kite, right, all of that stuff, they immediately go to, well, my hips were in the right place. Oh, okay, that's great. But if we didn't get to the point where we had to be hip to hip, what could we have done different? We've worked really hard in our building to really understand the stages of the brain. And so part of that de-escalation is understanding, when the student is regulated and when they're not regulated. And what are those, what does that look like? So I had seen that slide of the different parts of de-escalation, and poor Brian had to teach it to me in about 10 minutes, which was great, and I was able to bring it in. But what I learned was it's our job to identify where the student's brain is in the regulation cycle. And I can tell you the students we fail are the ones we don't see them about to flip their lid. And then when I go in and say, what are those signs that their lid's going to be flipped? And the staff say, I don't know, or it's going to be a struggle. And so really identifying and peeling back those layers are the only way that we can support our students well. And our Tier 3 students now that are not making progress in our building, we've got 2 specifically, we cannot identify those steps before the lid is flipped. And so that's where we've learned that we need to dig a little deeper. We also identify being able to identify when that student is going into crisis. So Brian said to me, he said in his old building, they used to say the 3rd time the student wasn't able to follow the direction. And so we started that. And I have one student that we give that direction 3 times, and when that student's not complying with the direction, we go into our crisis mode. We go into that routine. And it's gotten actually pretty good. So then now to the point that we have the walkies. Okay, I'm guilty, we have the walkie-talkies. But when that student gets to that point and we do need help, that we're able to say that her 3 times were given. And that's all telling us where that student's brain is. And that's telling all of us how to respond. But we've had to do this at a Tier 3 level because we can't have individual plans for each of our students. That's impossible as a staff to remember them. And so currently in our building, we have 3 students with individualized plans that when they go into crisis, that we respond maybe in a little bit of a different way.
Can I just use some language for people who are newer here?
Yeah.
If you're thinking 3 strikes and you're out, that is not at all what the point is made here. It is after 3 efforts to have the student follow instructions, if they're not, they're dysregulated and consequences have no impact. Mm-hmm. So it's not now, it's telling the staff no more consequences. I need to go into a support, monitor, help them get regulated mode. You can layer consequences from now to then at time, but they're just wrong. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, I just want to make sure.
No, thank you for clarifying.
And you're saying too, like, this isn't like machine gun 3 times, right? This is action.
Give it a direction.
Correct. Yeah.
Please sit down. I can see that you're upset. Can you please sit down at your desk and I will come and meet you there? Mm-hmm. Once. Mm-hmm. I see that you're still upset. If you go sit down at your desk, I will meet you there. Twice. We do it one more time, then we go into crisis. We go into our crisis plan for her. And her specifically is the point where we empathize, we give an empathy step, and then we give her direction. So I'm sorry that you feel that way. In her spot is you can choose to go to your social worker's office, or we have a sensory room. And so we say it, we give her the options, we step back, and we set our timer for about two minutes. And my staff know, they have the timer set on their phones already, because they're already set for 2 minutes. We step back and we wait. And her times have gotten shorter and shorter and shorter. To the point that if we ever have someone else come in and say, you can either go to the office or you can go to your social workers. She goes, that's not my plan. Okay. And she's like, I'm allowed this or that. And so she's now telling everyone else what her plan is. And that's because it's predictable. She understands. She knows that we're not going to layer on consequences. We don't call home. That's not our purpose. Our purpose is for you to regulate, be safe, and then be able to comply with the direction. The other thing we've really learned is that change is slow and steady. If I told you that we were able to accomplish this in a year, I'd be lying. The progress we've seen in our building has easily taken 5 years, and I really believe the positive changes that we're seeing is because of our consistency of practicing this for 5 years. So what we did is the state of Illinois has said if you use physical restraints in the last 3 years, that you have to give 8 hours of training in 5 areas. And one of those areas was de-escalation. And we, again, knew that the de-escalation that we were giving was not working. So we were able to work with Brian, get the materials, and start to implement on our own. And so I had to adjust it, right? Our building is a therapeutic day school. This is a little bit different than the general education. So we've adjusted it just a little bit to adapt. But we had really hard conversation as a staff. I said to our staff, we're going to do this, like it or not, but how do I meet your needs in giving you this training? And we're really tired after school, anybody else, right? And what do? We train staff after school when they're exhausted. And they agreed. We agreed that we were going to abandon in-person training and that we were going to start doing some more virtual videos. And so I just really used the slide deck from PBIS and I started making some videos. And they were pretty short. I think the first one's like 12 minutes, and I put the link in there if you want to see it. It's nothing fancy. I definitely don't have tech skills. I'm a tier 3 in tech, but I was able to learn how to screen record. That was a big one. And our staff really enjoyed those videos going out on Sundays. So I sent them out Sunday mornings. I time scheduled them in email. They received them on Sunday. And I can't tell you how many people said they opened them on Sunday and drank their coffee and listened to them. I was like, wow. I'm offering, I didn't even realize it, right? We're offering then staff to watch them when they're at their best. And when they're regulated, which goes a long way, right? And so they were watching these videos, and then we started to talk about them. We have at least 2 paraprofessionals or more in each classroom, and so our teachers committed to having conversations with them. So with the videos came little activities of reflection. And our teachers committed to, usually before school, saying, hey, let's make sure we all watch the video by Wednesday. We're just going to talk about it. And then we are continuing to work on our fidelity checks of that, so having those conversations. So our fidelity checks are moving towards, did you ask and communicate on where that student's brain is when they came into that situation? And just really having those conversations. And so I like charts, and then Brian likes charts, so we've combined our chart making together, so this is where we're at right now. But what you're going to see is I wanted the staff to see that this was meeting a need of ours and that this is just another tool in their toolbox, right? And so we looked at all of our training and practices on over here, and then we talked about what we're doing for ourselves as adults. What are we doing and putting the time in before our students even walk in? We're learning about trauma. We work really hard on adult wellness in our building. We do a lot of social emotional for adults. And we're doing that through our core practices. We're doing it through our CPI training. We also use UCARU systems. And that we also use our Dr. Green model as our tier 1 for collaborative problem solving. And then we look at the different phases of de-escalation. And what are we doing with our students? What are we doing when they come in and they're calm? What are we making sure we do with them? What practices have we put in place? And guess what? We found holes. We found holes in things that we weren't doing, right? And so we started to filling them in. And then we said, what are we doing when we start to see problem behavior? What are we doing what do we have that is in crisis? Right? We know with UCARU and NCI, we know how to go hands-on, we know how to block them, right? But what about that routine that Brian talked about? What are we doing in recovery? Guess what? We don't do this well. You know why? Because the next crisis is going on. Like, let's call it what it is. But we know we don't do that well. And then what are we doing for, systems and supports after the students leave? And so this is definitely draft 4. It's something we're continuing to do. In green, we feel like we do that really well. Yellow, we're working on it currently in PD now. And everything in black is still pretty much in like that beginning, practicing and teaching. So how has this helped our students? Our students are starting to use their coping skills a lot better. Last year, I think I just pulled this data the other day because, we just finished this 3 nights ago. But we had last year 359 physical restraints. We are down to 59 physical restraints. Believe it or not, though, and I put this in here to remind me, our number of referrals from physical aggression hasn't changed. So we're still getting the behaviors, but they're using the skills to avoid us having to go hands-on. This was 5 years of work. This was a lot of work. You can't stress that enough because this is stuff that keeps me up at night. Are we going fast enough? Are we meeting our students' needs? Should we be doing more? After this conference, I'm going to make my list, but I can't just throw it at my staff on Monday when I come back, right? Because that's not going to change anything. But this was being, thoughtful, planning, and putting that into place. Our crises for students are more trauma-informed. They know it doesn't matter what staff comes up to them, that routine is going to be completed. And that's helped our students tremendously. They're not intimidated by us. They don't feel it as a threat. And in fact, they're talking more to us, to telling us what's wrong. Because we've created time for us to not engage. And, we really talk about shut the heck up. Like, we do not talk when students are in crisis. And that's really hard for adults. We want to throw everything at them. And so when we set our timer, we stop talking. And so that's when our students start talking. And when we started it was about 2 minutes. Some of our students' plans are about 5 minutes, or we do not engage again. All right, so that's the progress of engage. Like, how did I do my timing? I beat Brian, right? All right, that was my goal. Listen, all right, we pass him on.
So I'm going to introduce Amber Casavan, and she's the district MTSS person at Gardner Public Schools, and Joyce West is a pupil personnel director, and she's from a small, urban, very poor, high needs district, and she's going to talk about what they've done.
And by the way, this one? Okay, so you guys can hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay, so Bob kind of gave you a little overview of kind of who we are. So I'll go through this kind of quickly. So Megan did a great job kind of hearing from one school. I'm going to kind of give you kind of what we've been doing for our whole district. So we are a fairly small district, even though we are technically a city. So we have 4 schools, elementary, which is pre-K through 4. We have 1 elementary school that has just over 1,000 students. So that's like half of our district is our elementary school. And I'm going to focus the D. Here we go. Okay, can you hear me now? It's like going in and out. Okay. So I'm going to focus most of the data and what the practices we're doing for our elementary school that used to be 2 schools and then combined into 1 larger elementary school. Bob talked about how we are like the more poor urban. We do have a growing diversity and a really high needs population. We do have a 22% students with disabilities, which is just over the state average for Massachusetts. So what were we doing kind of all along? So we did your typical annual crisis escalation training. We had a mandatory training. It was an online training for all staff. We do it the first week. It's self-paced. Staff could kind of do it on their own time. We do have a fidelity measure for that where staff sign off on at the end. But I don't know if anyone's willing to kind of volunteer or raise their hand and be honest if you've ever had to kind of complete online trainings that are mandatory and you scroll to the end and sign off. So we do have that in place. However, we do know that it's not enough. We also have CPI, as Megan mentioned. And so we do CPI training for our administrators. We do it for our substantially separate population. So all of the staff in our substantially separate programs, as well as our mental health staff. So that's what we had kind of been doing year to year. But what we didn't do a lot of was prevention. So just to orient you guys here, I organized our strategies based on the phases that Brian went over and Bob went over in the beginning. So we were doing escalation, we were doing some crisis, some restoration between the online module that we would do and our CPI. So in 2021, 22, when we really got better with PBIS and MTSS, this is when we started to add more prevention into our annual PD at the start of the school year. So we did a lot more with active supervision, encouraging appropriate behavior. This is where we did our training with all staff on the core elements of PBIS. Our elementary school that I mentioned really focused on training teachers and making sure that calm corners and area in the classroom was in place for students for all classrooms, kind of at that tier 1 level for de-escalation. And we also we had been using Swiss, but we really got better and really started using this with teachers, showing teachers the data, showing them what our referrals were looking like at the beginning of the year for the previous year. This is where we're at, this is where we're growing. So this is really where we added a lot more with prevention. So following that, adding all the prevention strategies, what we saw for initial outcomes is we saw a 42% decrease in our office discipline referrals for our elementary schools. We saw a distribution where our tier students having 6 or more office discipline referrals at tier 3 reduced down to 2%. And we also saw a decrease in office discipline referrals for our students with disabilities. We saw improvements in restraint data. So our elementary schools combined, the previous year had 30 restraints, physical restraints, and then the year with the intervention around more prevention, PBIS fidelity improved, that reduced down to 19. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened last year. And this was not planned, so it was an unintended reversal, kind of return to baseline. So our 2 elementary schools combined into 1. So it was a brand new school. We had 2 teams of administrators. We had 2 teams of mental health staff or our behavioral responders kind of learning to work together in a brand new building. And so what happened with this is a lot of the prevention strategies we had were not rolled out with fidelity at the start of the school year. So as I mentioned, they merged into 1. Other kind of key factors and context around this is that the physical environment of this new school, while it was very beautiful, it posed some physical and safety concerns when students would elope. And we had a lot of students that would elope at the elementary level. We had some kind of open top stairways that were a little high. We had doors that wouldn't lock, so students could run out of the building. There was still some construction sites, so it was very unsafe. We couldn't just kind of follow them with some kind of proximity. So with this, we did not have the prevention, our typical, what we had done the year before, all of our PBIS, because the school actually opened late. So what happened is we did still have our district, the online, self-paced, kind of train at hope pieces. We did still do our district CPI in another location, but no kind of all staff PD was held at that new building that year. So the prevention pieces were delayed or didn't happen. So we did see some changes. And the changes in the data is we saw a huge increase in our restraints. It's something that, we're very focused on, but we saw that, down to 19 shot up more than half. And, with that, we also saw increases in our office discipline referrals. We saw increases in our timeout, call them our calm down rooms, but our timeout locations. So although I'm telling you that, yes, we saw increases, and they were big increases in restraints, I'm not going to sugarcoat that at all. We were kind of continuously through this working on improving our tier 3 systems. So we were still focusing on our systems and our teams, while at the same time trying to put back in place the tier 1 prevention strategies that we had really focused heavily on the year before and had felt that actually, I would say that the school was kind of like a model school for prevention in tier 1. And so the focus had shifted more to tier 3, while at the same time not realizing that some of these things just weren't being in place with fidelity. So we did see improvements in tier 3. However, at the same time, without tier 1 being in place with fidelity, we were still seeing the big spikes in restraints and timeouts and office discipline referrals. So although we did see a big increase, the highlight here is that throughout the year, we were on top of it and we caught it. So our teams were still in place, our teams were still meeting, and we were able to catch this. So kind of as fall went on and we started to begin looking at our data, and it was probably right around December that we were like, oh my gosh, we are way above where we were for the whole school year last year. We need to do something. And so our PBIS and our MTSS teams and our administrators started really targeting all of the prevention strategies and training through different staff meetings. So they really focused heavily on getting all of those strategies and teaching to all staff back in place throughout staff meetings pretty continuously throughout the year. And with that, we did see a decreasing trend in our restraint frequency. So this is looking at the average frequency of restraints for the whole school per day per month, kind of how you would look at Swiss data on a monthly basis. And we did see that decreasing as strategies were put back in place, as teachers were beginning to have more classroom practices. We also, with this, saw a decrease throughout the year in the average duration in minutes per restraint per month. So this is looking at, the restraints at the beginning of the year were lasting on average 5.75 minutes, but by the end of the year, you're looking at 1.8, and June, that really tough month of the year, we actually were back down to an average of 1 minute when restraints were happening. So this year, learning from our mistakes, we caught this, this model school that, we've presented on several times and was doing excellent with all of these strategies. We know how important fidelity is, and we know that bumps in the road can happen, changes to makeup of school, physical environment, all of those things, need that extra care and that close attention to making sure that there's some good fidelity measures in place, not just for your strategies, but for your PD. So we are continuously improving. And so this year we made sure that all of that PBIS, MTSS initial training for all staff was in place during our first week of PD. So we have all of them back in place this year. We've also, from last year, really trying to kind of come up from behind. We added some additional PD throughout the year last year that we have in place again this year. So we have also focused on trauma-informed care and compassionate ABA trainings, not just for our substantially separate and our therapeutic programs, but for all staff, because we have a lot of students with autism, and they're in a large majority of our gen ed classrooms. We also have had all of our PBIS coaches trained in additional de-escalation strategies that was presented by Bob and Brian earlier today. So the 4 phases of de-escalation: keeping staff calm and regulated, vulnerable decision points, neutralizing routines, and kind of reframing with staff and students. So they were all trained during a PD day specific to coaches. And so their job at our first coaches meeting, which was in October 2nd, they made a plan for how they were going to bring at least one routine from this that they learned back to their school to train all staff. So on the first half-day PD day that we have, which is actually November 1st, all of the PBIS coaches in our district are bringing back some piece of this to train their whole staff to add to the prevention and the PBIS core elements in our classroom practices. So preliminarily, kind of where are we at right now, this just kind of sums up this whole story. So for any behavioral responders, BCBAs, or other kind of data geeks out there, so this is an ABA REAP design. So kind of that 1920 year was our baseline. It was before our intervention, which is our prevention and MTSS PBIS. This is looking at the total restraints for the month of September. So in 1920, we had 4 across our elementary schools. Then the next year for the month of September with MTSS PBIS, that dropped in half down to 2, again, for the month of September. Last year with the combined school, that shot way up to 8 for the month of September. And this year now, with our prevention back in place, we are back down to 2. What this looks like just last year to this year for the school that's combined is the average number of restraints per school day for September last year was 0.5, and this year we're down to 0.1. And thinking about what this means for like your number of different students that are impacted in your student population. So for this school, for over 1,000 students, this was last year, it was still under 1%, but it was still high. Like it was still across a few different students. And this year we're down to like 0.009 because it was one student that had the 2 restraints. So kind of key takeaways here, that lessons learned from us is really to focus on prevention, Tier 1 level PBIS, MTSS for de-escalation strategies and routines at the classroom level. Also to focus on staff de-escalation and regulation as well as the students. And also creating school-wide expected routines for de-escalation and work on fidelity of those routines, both in the classroom level for teachers as well as the students in their matrices. And I also love charts, and so be prepared that the next time this comes out, there will be a Gardner chart for this as well. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Thank you, first of all, for being vulnerable and sharing that data, because that allows us to understand that anytime change is going to occur, especially with the merging of schools, regardless of how hard you're hitting the ground, you're going to have bumps. And to expect that, but plan for it and be intentional. So I appreciate you sharing that with us.
And just so you know, the first day of school, the telephone system didn't work.
Wow.
Either internal or external, right? So that was how crazy it was.
Okay, we have a little under 15 minutes left. This is what I'd like for you to do. Turn to your shoulder partner, and you have 60 seconds. That's it. Not to do all the work. I want you to say, this is what reinforced my thinking. This is what's challenging my thinking. All right? And then we'll just take as many questions as we can after that. 60 seconds, just get your head. What's the question you got in your mind, okay? Go ahead. You guys want to pass the mic if they're going to talk to you, so he can pick it up on the audio. But come here so they can see you on the video. Not in front of that. That's weird. All right.
Ryan, repeat the question.
Okay, that was just a minute. All right, we have about 10 minutes for questions. We have wonderful people here. So let us know. Yes.
So my first question, Megan, was for you about thinking about adult wellness when we go through those crisis situations with students. I think sometimes as the people that are intervening in those crises, we feel like we're experiencing secondary trauma. So how do you address that with your staff to make sure that they do recover
Yeah.
in those situations?
So we use the Second Step for adults. So if you're familiar with Second Step, they have an adult curriculum. And we use it semi with fidelity. We have adapted it to the culture and climate of our building. But what that has done has allowed us to have more circle time as adults. And it really outlines conversations and making sure that we have, one, building trust, two, getting to know each other a little bit, right? Like saying, maybe you should tap this one out, right? And then it also gives us some time to just really have some check-in. So there's been some accountability to that. We also have a tap-out process at our school so that if you are engaging in a situation where you're not going to win, right, and someone identifies it, we have practiced that routine. It took a long time for my staff to be comfortable being, if we tapped them out, that they didn't see that as a failure. And so as administrators, we practice tapping each other out just with it, whether we need it to be or not, because we wanted to model to them that it was important to be able to walk away. And then we have a call on our walkies if we need to tap out so that so someone else can come and then they just switch places, because that is by far the most, if we're not regulated, we're never going to regulate a student. Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
You kind of might have spoken to this in that previous one, but how do you help support the idea that allowing a student time to de-escalate is not allowing them to disrespect you.
Yeah, I think that it has worked. We have worked really hard in our building to know that when a student is in crisis, that is not going to be time. We're never going to give a consequence for that, right? Like, so it's like if you're physically restraining a student, you get punched in the face. That we never hold that against the student because they're in crisis. So we've had to work really hard on, being able to tap out if the student's hitting home. I have an assistant principal who unfortunately has lost her mother. Every time she's in a situation with a specific student, he goes talk to her about her mom, right? Every single time. And so we know when that student goes, that my assistant principal, if she's in a good place, she'll go. If she's not in a good place, she'll say, I can't go right now. And so making sure that we know that we're at our best in handling that. There's not a day that my height and weight is not used against me in some derogatory way, right? That's the fun part about the job. But so we just make sure that we don't use that. So they can be. That's them cooling off. That's them in crisis, that their lid is flipped, and making sure, they are disrespectful during that time. And that's why it's so important to give them that wait time. And when we've done that well, they are more apologetic afterwards. And we work really hard on restoring that relationship because they don't have necessarily positive relationships. So they don't want us, they're right there anticipating us leaving them and holding this against them, that we've had to fill that and really restore those relationships. So they know that you can be upset with us and we're not going to hold that against you, and we're going to come back together. And we're seeing less of that, I would say, with the students.
The other thing I would suggest would be is really using your data to say this is really working or it's not working, right? In terms of that. So Gardner has used a lot of the data around individual kids to be able to say, what's working, what's not working in terms of that, and that helps. This is working. Let's just keep going, right? Yeah. So.
Back, yeah.
There's a hand down here too.
I just was gonna ask, like, that teacher buy-in piece, was the data really what, at Gardner specifically, just because, like, you had so many situations and obviously there was like, we have all this trauma, or we have all this crisis. Whereas, like, just the more typical looking school district, right? Is that what got the most teacher buy-in?
I think sharing the data is definitely a huge piece of it. So sharing the data with staff, but also it being kind of, part of creating habits with staff. And so, it wasn't, one PD that we did at the start of the school year and then never mentioned again. So it was kind of like, that was our big kickoff PD. But then, for staff to getting the buy-in is that there's something related to PBIS and kind of tier 1 practices in just about every PD, even if it's just a quick update on like upcoming things or new, whether it has to do with like the number of dojo points, by grade and classroom celebration. So I think also there's a lot of teacher incentives. So things like teacher shout outs. So staff give other staff shout outs and recognize staff appropriate behavior and behaviors, that they want to see. And we also have celebrations for staff that are giving out the highest acknowledgement points for students, things like that too. So I think finding ways to celebrate staff using these systems, similar to the way we do with students, also helps with buy-in as well as the data.
At my school too, something our teachers struggle with is when we have little students who we escalated at once within the classroom. And like I know they're just sort of how do we prevent that, but then also how do you respond to that? Because they feed off each other, and then it just gets higher to a point where those higher level of interventions end up being used, but we're unsure where to intervene.
Yeah.
you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is when it's happening to multiple students at once or dysregulated at one time in a classroom, and how do you respond to that? So I had a PD this year with my staff. I've been doing this for 5 years, and one of them goes, oh, this has been about our behavior the whole 5 years. Yeah, right? And so it was this aha moment. And so what we do is we have monthly data meetings, and if 80% of your students are having issues or not, are unable to follow directions at once, then it's a staff issue and a classroom management issue. So then we go back to precision statements, going to tier 1 practices. And so I would say under 10%, maybe 10% of the time we have more than one issue going on at once in a classroom now, because we've had to go back to the system of how that classroom is running, and that has decreased the multiple events. But, yesterday while I was gone, there was a fight in a classroom, right? So it happens. And so it's just making sure that we then have preventative strategies. So if this whole class goes off at once, what's that routine?
So similarly, I love the idea of a clear process that you engage with and a student. We were talking about how great that is, right? Mm-hmm. But I can see how often a barrier is that, I don't have a parent in my classroom, mm-hmm. and I have to be teaching, so I don't have time to engage in a 3-step process with a student. Do you have any advice on how to?
I'm staffed for that, so I'm going to pass it on.
Yeah.
So your question was kind of in a gen ed classroom, how would staff that maybe don't have additional support be able to provide kind of a 3-step type of routine? So for us, it's definitely, something that we're continuously working on. But what some of the things we've done is, we're really focused on bringing back some of these routines, and one of them being kind of a neutralizing routine. So even if it's not a multi-step routine, if we can get staff to just identify when they're beginning to be not calm or dysregulated, and getting them to kind of count to 10, take a breath. There's different strategies to kind of neutralize before responding. So it's kind of, there's the behavior, you want to respond, if you can just pause before you respond. So that's something that a lot of our PBIS coaches are planning to bring back, kind of recognizing the times a day, maybe that they might be most dysregulated or most likely to respond that way, those vulnerable decision points, but then also just getting staff to pause before they respond is one of the ones that we're focused on in the gen ed classroom. But then in addition to classrooms that maybe don't have a para support or a co-teacher, if they do need the additional 3-step routine for students, what we did is instead of just having administrators respond on walkie calls, we have all of our mental health staff. So we've begun kind of flipping that. Instead of students going to see a counselor when they're dysregulated, we have counselors coming into the classroom to help provide and model for teachers as well.
How long did you hear that they've been working on these systems? Okay. So I think one of the most important takeaways, especially for those who are newer to getting PBIS going, you're starting with the basics and you're getting organized, and keep tapping into your own coaching and technical assistance. You guys have been receiving coaching. You've been a part of this for years, and just keep peeling the onion, going deeper and deeper and deeper, and then it's continuous improvement. Both of your stories had continuous improvement. Nothing's ever perfect. It will not happen. But your goal is, okay, so what support would you need for the next 5 years to continue to change and build the environment of your school that's going to be successful? That, to me, that's the takeaway. So commit to your own coaching and training for yourself, okay? Can we thank our exemplars? They're exceptional. Thank you for sharing your story. All right, bye everybody. Have one more session, enjoy it, and then enjoy your weekend.